Hello, this is John Wyatt, and this is the next in a series of talks on the principles of medical ethics. And today we're looking at the issue of euthanasia and assisted suicide. This is a topic which is causing controversy and debate around the world, and in many countries around the world there's new pressure to change the law to allow some kind of medical killing or medically assisted suicide for people who feel their lives are not worth living. Here in the UK, where there's been a whole series of really tragic stories where individuals have decided to take their lives. Many of them have decided to go to the clinic in Switzerland, the Dignitas clinic, where they've received lethal medicines and have killed themselves. This, for instance, is the story of Daniel James, who was a very promising young rugby player here in the UK, and then involved in a tragic accident. He fractured his cervical spine, he was paralysed from the shoulders downwards, and he decided that his life was not worth living. He was a very sporty guy. He tried to commit suicide, he failed. His parents tried to support him and bought him equipment and so on, but eventually he told them, if you really love me, you'll help me to kill myself. And so they agreed, and they went with him to Switzerland, to the clinic there, and he took medicine and died. And what was interesting was that there was such a positive response in the newspapers. People said what a great thing his parents had done in supporting their son. They didn't put their own interests first. They wanted to do what was best for him. And why on earth did we have to travel to Switzerland to have this done? Why can't we have it here in the UK? Another story that hit the headlines was that of Jeff Spector. He was a local businessman. He'd done quite well. He was a self-made man. He was quite healthy, but then he discovered that he had an inoperable tumour on the spine which was slowly enlarging, and he was told by his doctors that he was going to become paralysed and probably incontinent. And Jeff Spector said, no way, that's not me, that's not the way I want to end my life. So he called his friends and his family together, and they had a celebration meal, and there at the meal he told them that the following day he was booked to go to Dignitas, and he was taking lethal medicine, which is what happened, and he killed himself. And again, it was interesting that the local comment was very positive, and said, you know, what a noble way to die. Jeff didn't want to be a burden to his family and to his friends. He wanted to do it his way, and isn't this a better way to die than to end up dying in hospital with tubes coming out of every orifice? In fact, in surveys that have been done in the UK, up to 80% of people have said that they're in favour of a change in the law. Although it's very interesting, of course, in these public surveys, the precise way in which you frame the question can make a big difference in the percentage of people who will vote one way or another. But there's definitely rising pressure around the world for this kind of legislation. And so one of the questions we need to ask ourselves is why? Why is it that that some form of medical killing or assisted suicide is being seen as an obvious way for people to end their lives? I think a related issue is the whole issue of dementia. As the incidence of dementia is rising steadily in our societies, this is because it's an age-related condition, and therefore the more older people we have in our societies, the more people are being affected by dementia. And studies have suggested that dementia has replaced cancer as being the most feared way to die. That people just dread the prospect of losing their minds, of ending up dependent and confused, and in a home or in some other kind of institution. And so suicide seems a better alternative. It seems better to kill yourself than to know that this kind of fate is coming in the future. But of course, these are not just issues out there in society. They affect all of us, including in the Christian community as well. And so one of the questions that comes up is what does it mean to die well and to die faithfully as a Christian believer? If you ask most people how they want to die, people would say something like, I want to die in my bed at night. I don't want to have any warning. I don't want to have any premonition. I just want to go out like a light. Wouldn't that be a wonderful way to go? What's interesting is that if you were to go back a few hundred years and ask Christian believers what was the best way to die, they would say that that kind of sudden, unexpected death was actually the worst way to die. To be catapulted into eternity with no possibility to prepare yourself, for meeting your maker, no possibility to say goodbye to your loved ones, no possibility to restore relationships which have been broken. That would be a terrible way to die. But it's because changes in attitudes have meant that now we think that's the best way to die. In fact, if you look at how most people die in developed countries, it's often they die in hospitals. They die, for instance, with failed cardiopulmonary resuscitation going on, or they die in an intensive care unit with tubes coming out of every orifice. And so the reality of how so many people die is quite different from what many people would wish to die. And it's also interesting that in studies that have been done, particularly in the USA, looking at religious people who use what's called religious coping, religious ways of coping with their own terminal illness, that when you look at those people, for instance, dying of cancer, and you compare them with secular people who don't use, quotes, religious coping, then actually the religious people are more likely to insist on having futile treatment at the end of life. They're more likely to die in an intensive care unit. They're less likely to have made a do not resuscitate order. They're less likely to have nominated someone else to act as a healthcare proxy. And so there's clearly a lot of issues here about understanding what it means to die well and to die faithfully as a Christian believer. One of the very interesting issues in the whole debate that goes on in public is the use of language. And it's very common to find a whole list of euphemisms, of nice sounding words, which are being used to replace the clear words like killing, like suicide, or like euthanasia. Words such as ensuring a dignified death, the right to die, the right to choose at the end of life, easing the passing, assisted dying, easeful death. It often leads to a lot of confusion. What exactly do these words mean? And so I think as we start to think about this from a Christian perspective, one of the first things we need to be is very clear about our use of language. There's an ancient Chinese proverb that says the beginning of wisdom is to call things by their proper names. And that's what we need to do, to use language carefully. So what do we mean by euthanasia? Of course, literally euthanasia just means euthanatos, a good death, but it's used to mean intentional medical killing of someone whose life is thought not to be worth living. So the emphasis here is on killing. It is to introduce death into a situation. And it is intentional. The aim is to kill. And it's very important to recognize that the drugs which euthanasia doctors use in places like Netherlands or in Oregon State, those drugs are not the drugs of the palliative care doctors. They don't use opiates or benzodiazepines. They use, in fact, huge doses of barbiturates, lethal doses, often 50 to 100 times a therapeutic dose, and sometimes combined with muscle relaxants, which cause instant paralysis. So these are the drugs of the anaesthetist. They're not the drugs of a palliative care doctor. And it's plain that the intention is to kill quickly, swiftly, and without pain. So the intention is to introduce death. And it's the same with assisted suicide. In medically assisted suicide, the doctor calculates the lethal dose, ensures that the lethal medicine is made available, instructs the patient in how to take the medicine. For instance, that if they're taking it orally, that they have to take an antiemetic drug first, that they have to remain upright, that they should, in order to try and avoid vomiting and aspiration. The doctor does everything possible to try and ensure that death occurs, but the doctor holds back from the final act. But I think it's pretty clear that morally, the doctor is involved in the desire, the intention to bring death. The intention is to kill, to end life quickly and cleanly. And of course, that's very different from palliative care. In a future program, we're going to look at the principles of palliative care and contrast that with the use of euthanasia, with this intentional killing. So in the public debate that goes on, there are two main arguments that are being used. These are the most frequent arguments they use. The first is the argument based on compassion. That people are suffering, people are in agony. If you see someone in such terrible agony, surely a compassionate act is to help them to bring their life to an end. And you can see superficially what an attractive argument that is. But of course, if you stand back and think about it, compassion has been used. It's a very slippery term. And if you know anything about the history, for instance, of the Second World War and of the Third Reich in Germany, it was compassion that was used as the argument behind the euthanasia program that killed disabled people, that killed people with mental health issues, and that ultimately killed people, undesirables like Jews. The argument was it was compassionate to help these people to end their lives, or to end the life for them. So compassion is a very slippery term, and yet it's something that is often used as an argument. And the second argument that is used mainly in the public debate is that of autonomy. We've looked at autonomy before in some of these talks, but autonomy, autonomos, means my right to control my own life, my right to make my own decisions. And to many modern people who are used to controlling every other aspect of their life, it seems bizarre that I'm not allowed to control the time and the manner of my dying. If I can control every other aspect of my life, why on earth do I not have the right to decide when I want to die at the time of my own choosing? Again, this seems superficially like a very strong argument, but of course it's not as simple as that. We're not just saying, no one's arguing that anybody should have the right to take their life under any circumstances. So then there have become a whole series of hurdles. You should only be allowed to kill yourself if you've got a terminal condition, or you have hopeless and unbearable suffering, and you have to pass various tests. You have to show that you're mentally competent, and so on. So these two arguments are the arguments which are being used in the public debate. In future talks, we're going to look at a Christian response to this, and how palliative care provides what I see as a much better and a more Christian response to this terrible desire to kill yourself. I close with these words of H.L. Mencken, American journalist of the previous generation. He said, "There's always an easy solution to every human problem. Neat, plausible, and wrong." And that's what euthanasia and suicide is. It appears to be neat, plausible, it appears to provide a solution, but actually it's wrong. And so in the next talk, we're going to look at a Christian response to the end of life care. What if killing is not the right way, then what's a better way forward? But here are some questions for us to discuss. What are some of the social, personal and spiritual factors that are leading to the pressure for euthanasia and assisted suicide in many countries? Secondly, what are some of the risks and dangers if euthanasia or assisted suicide were to be legalized in your country? And thirdly, why have many modern people lost the belief that suffering or dependence can have any positive consequences? Yes, thank you very much, and greetings again from London. And it's my privilege to be in this wonderful event reaching across the globe. And again, I just want to give thanks to God for the amazing technology that He has given, that He has allowed us to use it. Even in this time of COVID, He has provided this technology to enable us to share together. So that short video gave the arguments why euthanasia and medical killing is now, I am afraid, it is spreading across the world. It has started in the West. It is mainly in Netherlands, but it is now spreading across the USA, and it is in Canada. And Canada has become one of now the centers for medical killing, I'm afraid. And just recently in the UK, the British Medical Association had a poll amongst doctors, and the majority said they were in favor of assisted suicide. And I fear very much that within the next few years, medical killing will be legalized in the UK. And when that happens, I'm afraid, unless by God's grace this is stopped, it will spread across many countries, because many countries see Europe and the UK as in some way the gold standard for medical ethics and medical law. And so if we're killing people, then I'm afraid it's going to go around the world. So we need to understand this. I'm afraid for many of you doctors in your lifetime, you will have to face the reality that medical killing is happening. And I think we need to prepare in advance to understand the arguments. And so I talked briefly about these two arguments, the argument about compassion and the argument about choice, autonomy. But just very briefly, let me say, from a Christian point of view, I believe killing is always wrong. We don't have, God has not given us the right to kill another person, and certainly not to kill an innocent person. I want to leave aside the whole question about warfare and just warfare, and also about legal execution. These are two separate issues. In healthcare, we're saying there is no right that we have as doctors either to kill or to help someone else to kill themselves. But whenever we say that something is wrong, we must immediately say, and here is a better way. And so what is the better way? Well, the better way is palliative care. Did you know that palliative care was really invented by Christian doctors as a Christian response to help people to die well? And at the heart of that is the idea that death, although it is an enemy, helping people to die by treating their symptoms, by helping them to make the very best of the last few days or weeks or months of their life, using medication, but also treating other aspects. This is a very Christian response. So I think as Christians, we must really understand why palliative care is a Christian response. And then we must do everything we can to encourage the development of this as the way to oppose the spread of medical killing across the world. If you take the Abrahamic faiths, so not just Christianity, but also Judaism and Islam, because we all share a basic understanding that human life is a gift from God and that humans are made in God's image, all the three Abrahamic faiths are generally opposed to euthanasia. I'm much less clear about the Eastern religions, and that would be an interesting thing to discuss about Hinduism and Buddhism and the other Eastern religions. But we also find in the West, there are many doctors, although they are not Christians or religious believers, they do believe very strongly in the ethical framework that doctors are there to protect people, but they're never there to kill. So I have found many of my colleagues are opposed to medical killing. But what I see is that as the atheism and the secularism is advancing across through our society, these ideas are like acids. They slowly dissolve the resistance. And so I see it as the older doctors who are more opposed to medical killing. But now we have a whole generation of young doctors and medical students, and they say, well, I don't see what's the problem. I think medical killing is okay. And so I think as we will find that there are fewer people who agree with us that medical killing is wrong. We have a number of very famous rugby players who've had a similar accident and who've become paralyzed. But their response has not been to kill themselves. Many of them have become athletes who are in the Paralympics. You know, the idea of you know, for instance, wheelchair sports, of learning to overcome their disabilities, of finding meaning and life even despite severe disabilities. And I heard some of these people saying how sad it was about Daniel James. If only they had been able to talk to him and to share the possibility of finding that just because he was disabled, it didn't mean that his life had no value. So I think there were many positive ways of helping people who are, I mean, in retrospect, Daniel James was depressed. which is very common after you've had that kind of major life-changing kind of event. You know, I have to be honest, I went through a period of very severe depression, and I was in hospital in a locked ward because of a mental illness due to stress. And I too started to think maybe I should kill myself. But praise God, someone didn't come along and say, well, just sign on this form and then we can kill you. We'll take you to Dignitas. But thank God that I was met with love and with compassion and with care and with healing. And then as I recovered, I realized, why should I want to kill myself? My God has given me this life and I must serve him with it. So I understand how it's possible to be filled with despair, but killing is never the best answer. Of course, compassion is good. God says, I'm a compassionate God, a God of compassion. And we are called to be compassionate to our patients. But compassion does not lead to killing. Compassion leads to care. It leads to pain relief. It leads to finding other ways of helping people. And I just like to say something in another video, which I haven't got time to show now. I talk about in palliative care, one of the founders, a wonderful Christian doctor called Cicely Saunders in the UK, she said there were 4 types of pain. There's physical pain, but also there is psychological pain, which she was talking about dying people, things like depression and despair and so on. There is relational pain. So often dying people, their relationships are damaged and maybe broken. And then there is spiritual pain. People may feel guilt, may feel a sense of meaninglessness, may be worried about what's going to happen when they die. And so she said, we must treat the physical pain using medication like opiates, but we do not stop there. We must treat the psychological pain. We must treat the relational pain by helping to restore relationships. And we must treat the spiritual pain. So in the hospice that this doctor set up, she put a chapel of worship in the center of the hospice. And it was possible for every patient who wished to be pushed, even if they were close to death, in their beds, they could be pushed into the chapel. And there were services of worship, and they could receive the Holy Communion. And so she put worship right in the center of the care of the dying. And you know, in most pagan religions, certainly before the time of Christ, suicide was seen as a very positive thing. A suicide was sometimes the act of a nobleman, or it was the act of a great warrior to kill yourself, and it was celebrated. The Stoics would sometimes celebrate suicide, but the interesting thing is that in the Bible, suicide is never seen as a noble or honorable act. If you think of the suicides that you get in the Bible, you think of the suicide of King Saul in the Old Testament, or you think of Judas Iscariot in the New Testament. Suicide is an act of despair and an act of hopelessness. It's never seen as a positive act. And so and one of the interesting things, you know, sadly, some people that I know, some close friends, have committed suicide. And what I have seen is how much pain that causes to everybody else. Like I can remember a lovely Christian girl in her 20s who was so loved, and she was used by God in many ways. And then she had a deep depression and she killed herself. And at the service, there were hundreds of people in that church, and they were just pouring out their grief and their love for this girl. And I was only thinking, if only she could have been there before she killed herself, if only people had said that to her before she died. So suicide causes terrible pain to everyone around herself. And therefore, we should protect people from suicide. Suicide is not a good thing. And in fact, suicide prevention, is something we all learn as doctors, to make sure that we try to reduce the possibility that our patient will commit suicide. A terrible and painful situation. What about the patient who is in an irreversible coma, like the persistent vegetative state? Now, it's important to distinguish two different situations. One is the situation where there is a patient in intensive care who has very severe brain injury, and they are completely, they have no chance of recovery, but their life is being maintained artificially by a ventilator, by intensive support. Is it right to switch off the ventilator? Well, yes, it is. There is a time to say enough is enough. And if the life is being maintained artificially by life support, by ventilation and so on, then I believe it is right to, provided everybody agrees and the prognosis is hopeless and so on, the right thing to do is to switch off the life support and allow someone to die. But notice, we are not killing them. When someone dies in that situation, what is the cause of death? What do you write on the death certificate? You don't write, stop, cause of death, ventilator stopped. The cause of death is severe brain injury. It is coma. It is whatever the pathological process. But when you go to Dignitas and you receive a lethal injection, what is the cause of death? Well, it's the lethal injection. It's that's what killed you. So I think it's clear there is a difference between allowing death to occur and actually causing death. Now, what about the person in the persistent vegetative state? They are breathing, all their organs are working, their kidneys are working, their bowel is working, they're breathing, but it's not possible to communicate with them. In fact, these people go through a sleep-wake cycling. Sometimes their eyes are open, sometimes they seem to sleep. The only thing that they need is they need food and water. And the question is, should you starve them to death? And I personally believe that as a Christian, we should always give food and water, because that is not medical treatment. This is the basic requirement of hospitality. Do you remember Jesus said, whoever gives a cup of cold water in my name? That's basic hospitality. When you're in the desert and you come across somebody, what do? You give them water, you give them food. And so what is our responsibility for this patient in persistent vegetative state? I believe we should be hospitable. We give them water, we give them food. Everything else, we don't have to. We don't have to give sophisticated medical treatment. But I believe we should not intentionally kill. When I was a medical student, and it's a long time ago now, in the 1970s, it was still quite common for doctors not to tell people the truth, not to tell the patient the truth. Quite often we would lie to them, so that if someone says, "Am I dying, doctor?" and the doctor says, "Oh, no, it's just a little problem. You're going to be fine," even though the doctor knew that there was terminal cancer. And sometimes we encourage the relatives to lie. Don't tell them they're dying. Just pretend everything is fine. But we now believe this is completely wrong, because if you are lying to people, they cannot trust you. How can I trust the doctor? Because the doctor is saying, it's fine, don't worry. And so we now understand that the basis of truth, a basis of trust, is based on truth. And that means even if the relatives don't want us to tell the truth, we should tell the truth, but we must do it gently. We must do it with compassion. And we only tell as much truth as people want to know. So I would, in this situation, I would explain to the relatives, well, I understand you don't want me to say anything, but I have a duty to the patient. I have a duty of honesty and care. So what I would then do is I would sit down alone with the patient and I would say to them, I have information about your disease, but I wonder, do you really want to know that? Do you want me to explain to you what is happening? Or do you feel perhaps you don't want to know? Because if you don't want to know, I'm not going to force you. But if you do want to know, I'm going to try and explain gently. And you know what you often find in this situation? The patient says, oh, thank you so much, doctor, for telling me, but don't tell the relatives. And so you have this strange game. The relatives don't want the patient to know, the patient doesn't want the relatives to know. And then you think, really? And actually then, you know, I would bring them both into the room together and I would say, we've had this conversation and now I want you to know that everybody knows in this room what the truth is. And that is a really big issue. And I understand in many low resource countries, there are very limited ITU facilities. And of course, now at a time of COVID, this is a real issue because we know that it's possible that some people can be kept alive with severe COVID infection, but then is this the best use and how do we decide? So I think this is a really difficult issue and I don't have any easy answer, but what I do think is you must always balance the benefits and the burdens of any treatment. So just because we have the ITU here, it does not mean that I have a duty to treat the first patient who needs it. I must balance how much benefit will this give. So we know in COVID, unfortunately, the mortality for many people, even if they go into ITU, the mortality is 70, 80, 90%. And sometimes they will live for 3 weeks in the ITU and then they will die. So in that situation, it's much better for that patient not to be admitted to the ITU, but to be just given palliative care. So we always care, but we don't have to give the highest level of care. And so in the UK, we talk about ceilings of care. We say, we'll do this much. Maybe we'll give oxygen, we'll give an intravenous infusion, we might give CPAP, but that's the maximum care that we should give. And so for each patient, we have to decide what is the maximum level of care, and we save the highest level of care, the intensive care unit, to the patient who is most likely to benefit. These are difficult issues, but sometimes we have no choice but to make these kind of decisions. And that story in John's Gospel about Lazarus is so amazing and so wonderful because, yes, it's clear that Jesus did delay going to see Lazarus, and maybe it is true that because he withheld treatment that Lazarus died. I just want to say, I think the language of passive euthanasia is not helpful because it implies that there's no difference between passive euthanasia and active euthanasia. But I've just tried to explain they're quite different. Allowing death to occur is not the same as killing. So I recommend that we do not use the language of passive euthanasia, but nonetheless, it's clear that Jesus did allow Lazarus to die. Why did he do that? Well, he's God. Who are we to argue with him? But of course, he knew what was going to happen. And as many Christian preachers have said, Jesus wept at the grave of Lazarus. He wept at the terrible tragedy of death, even though he knew what was about to happen. And that sort of ties in the mystery of the fact that God both allows terrible evil, and yet his plan ultimately is to bring redemption and resurrection. And so the difference is that Lazarus discovered the power of Jesus over death a bit earlier. The rest of us are not going to discover that wonderful life-raising power until beyond the grave. But when Jesus comes again and the new heaven and the new earth are created, all of us will discover the power of God over death, and we will share in the new heaven and the new earth. And that's the hope we have to keep our eyes fixed on. Yes, death is a reality, death is an enemy, but it's a defeated enemy, and we look towards the time when Jesus is going to inaugurate a new heaven and new earth, and death will be no more. The thing is, the sad thing is that although palliative care, when you see an expert doing palliative care, it is absolutely wonderful to see the skill of doctors who show compassion and care for dying people. But, you know, I'm afraid most people around the world don't receive any care like that, even in mission hospitals, and often the care of the dying is not good. And so I would really encourage you, and maybe some people watching this video, to see that God is calling us to learn more about how to care for the dying well, because that is a fantastic sign of Christian love. And the truth is, you know, of course, many people die even without faith in God, but I have seen and heard stories of people who have turned to faith and turned to Christ, sometimes just hours or minutes before death. And so helping people, the physical pain, the psychological pain, the relational pain, but also the spiritual pain, showing people the chance of recovery and of forgiveness and new life in Jesus. And just like the dying thief, he's not alone. He found Christ just minutes or hours before his death, and many other people have done the same.